Hello, everyone. Welcome to our show. Today, we are talking about how to break down stereotypes at work with business owner, content creator, blog writer, career coach. She does a little bit of everything. This is Masha, and I'm going to say her last name wrong, so I'm going to pause for myself. Zvereva. Did I say it close enough? Close
Perfect.
enough?
Perfect.
All right. So welcome, Masha. It's amazing to have you on the show. So excited to have you today.
Thank you so much for having me. So excited to be here on your podcast and to talk to you. Thank you so much for that super warm intro.
Well, and if you guys don't follow Masha on social media, she's on TikTok, she's on Instagram, all of it under Stereotype Breakers. And she shares so much good information about how women can get into STEM jobs, how they can navigate the workplace. So I'd love to hear, Masha, how did you get into that?
Absolutely. Oh my God, it was a long, long story. Of course, it was an evolution. There's always an evolution there, but essentially, what kicked it all off for me was when I graduated from my master's degree in marketing, essentially, back in the day. And I'm from Russia. So I was trying to find a job in Europe. I got my master's degree in Europe, and I was trying to stay in Europe. I needed a work visa, and even for someone who had a master's degree in marketing, it was just impossible to stand out. Everybody, all of my peers had a master's degree, and it was just like, how do I even get a work visa? So I started learning how to code in order to differentiate myself and, market my CV a little bit or
Yeah.
resume. And long story short, I realized how many stereotypes. Long story short, I never actually got into coding professionally. But I realized how many stereotypes and just biases there are in the tech industry, and how many of those live inside our heads as well, just because of the way we were brought up and socialized and all of that fun stuff. So it has been an evolution. I started a blog documenting myself learning how to code, just trying to show that if I can do it, anybody can do it. And then eventually started off as coding blonde because that just described me. And I thought,
Love it.
coming from Russia, from a very, very conservative society where so many stereotypes around blondes and what they can do and cannot do, um, that's that was the thinking behind the initial name. And then I've rebranded to Stereotype Breakers and moved closer to the mission that I'm on now, back in 2021. And the mission is to drive female impact and innovation in STEM by giving them the resources and the tools to navigate the workplace, the game, to advocate for themselves, and to ultimately change the workplace to meet their needs.
Yeah.
So, yeah.
And that's so amazing. And it's interesting as I'm in tech as well. And Masha and I, the first time we chatted, learned that we also live very close to each other, and we're dealing with a hellacious 12 inches of snow this week. So it's like a whole separate issue that we could talk about for probably an entire episode. But as a woman in tech, it's so interesting to hear your background as a marketing. I remember the first job that I ever took where I was a more senior level in tech. And I walked into a meeting room and I sit down, I'm setting my stuff up, and this guy walks in and goes, "Oh no, marketing meets on that side of the building." And I was like, "Oh, that's so nice for people in marketing.
Mhm.
Thank you for sharing." And I
Exactly.
just stayed there, and he just looked at me and I just looked at him, and we just both waited until my boss entered and was like, "Oh, Kendall, I'm glad you found the room okay. This is Kendall, she's new to our team." And the guy was like, "I'm so sorry, I gotta sit down." So it's so interesting how you come up against these, as a woman in tech, as a woman in STEM, and honestly, just the more senior you get as a woman in general, that there's these different stereotypes. So, what is something, being a woman in the workplace, having experienced tech, that you were not expecting about, the workplace, about the tech industry? What is something that kind of surprised you as you got into it?
100%. Well, I mean, we can see that. First of all, thank you for sharing that story. I felt the cringe, just with every ounce of my body. And good for you for having such a great response. A lot of the times, I think of the great response after the situation,
Yeah,
but this is the
an hour
perfect
later.
example. Yeah, exactly. When it's like, I think it was called, it's called the elevator dilemma or something like that, where you think about it in the elevator, but Good for you. You thought of it like on the spot, and that's amazing. But something that has surprised me is, well, we see that there aren't as many women in leadership positions, right? In a lot of industries, and tech is not. Unfortunately, tech is also faulty of that. And something that I have found through some of the research that I've been doing on, relationships and how women are perceived in the workplace, etc., is that the higher women climb, the higher up the corporate ladder that women climb, the more stereotyped they are, the more they have to navigate that double bind, the more they are perceived as a representation of their gender, as opposed to an equal contributor, right? Someone who is making an impact as an equal. And so, it's harder. The higher you get within the system, the harder it becomes to navigate it, because you are just judged from all sides. So that's something that I have found incredibly surprising, even in an industry that, claims to be so innovative. I always have an issue with this word, but you know what I mean.
Yeah. Well, and it's interesting that you bring that up. So I run a book club on my social media, and we read in February The New Extraordinary Leader. It was a really interesting book, but it had a study at the back about women in corporate specifically, and it showed basically job success by age for the two genders. And what it showed was that men, until about the age of 40, are wildly more successful than women. They have more confidence, they show up better to work, they're able to execute their projects at a higher level of efficiency, they're more willing to take risks. And at age 40, it switches. And women all of a sudden become stronger at work, and they become the better employees, and they become more successful. And this particular study attributed it to confidence, that 40 is also the age where women come into their confidence. And they feel like they can walk into a room and demand respect and highlight their skills and advocate for themselves. And 40 is when men start to lose theirs. And it was such an interesting shift to show side by side that, like, as confidence increases, your ability to succeed at your job, to be a good leader, to be a good employee, correlates. And so it's so fascinating when I work with female clients. If I'm like, hey, have you talked to your boss about that? And they're like, no. If I talk to my male clients, I'm like, did you talk to your boss about that? They're like, yeah, like 12 times. So this is whatever we've had every conversation. This is how it's gone. Because there's just that confidence, that willing to advocate for self.
Yes.
And it's something interesting that we see. And it does, I think, lead to fewer women in leadership positions. It leads to, kind of that reputation. And then I think women, at least in my experience, tend to go one of two ways. They either extremely compensate in one direction, where they become really hard and really tough and really focused and really results oriented, or they go the other way and they're just like the soft, happy people who are just like glad to be there. And you have like these two extremes and not a lot in the middle. And it's a really interesting way that we try to navigate these stereotypes for ourselves.
100%. Oh my God, so many different things that I want to address in that. So first of all, that study is fascinating. I need to look it up. And I wonder if they controlled for a variable that I'm currently studying, because I'm doing research for a book that I'm hoping to write about how having children impacts women's careers. And obviously for those women who choose to have children. And there's an interesting study that I have found that there's a 10-year gap where having children impacts women, slows down women's careers the most. And it's if a woman has a child between the ages of 25 and 35. That slows them down the most relatively to their male peers, as opposed to outside of those, before 25 and then after 35. So I wonder because I see that there's that potential ramp up. This is like couch psychologist right now and me talking. But I see a potential ramp up to 40 where women start becoming more successful there than their male peers, which is interesting, something to look into. But also that divide that you were talking, I've been reading a lot of books lately and creating content on this topic of women going in either of those directions, right? Super numbers and results oriented versus super, just warm and community first. So a lot of social psychologists talk about these two dimensions that we're judged on, and their competence and warmth. And the graphics that we use in our presentations, the body language that we have, even what we're wearing, our clothing, those are all little signals, and 90% of our perception of other people and women is basically on those two dimensions, competence and warmth. And you can be displaying those. The goal is to balance them out, because that is the sweet spot of charisma. As this author, Vanessa Van Edwards, talks about in her book Cues, which is also amazing. And I need to follow up on your book as well. I need to write it down and read it.
Book recommendations for the listeners. We're like, thank you for listening, but also you should read. And here's the laundry list of books that Masha and I have been checking out that we recommend.
Exactly. Bookworms.
No, but it is so interesting, because I think, in a lot of ways, Masha, you and I have connected before. And I think we think very similarly about a lot of things. And one of the ways where I feel like you and I differ, which has always been really interesting, is I tend to fall more in the coaching of like, the system is the system. Here's how you navigate it, right? Which is like, as a woman, how do you find that balance between competency and warmth? How do you find these areas where you can show that you're delivering great results, but in a way that makes you perceived as welcoming and easy to work with and a good partner? And it's so interesting because you take a honestly stronger stance of, why don't we just change the system to work for us instead, which I have so much respect for, and I think is such an interesting take on what's happening, because the corporate world really is built assuming that it is your number one priority. And especially for women, that generally tends not to be the case, because we have children, we have hobbies, we have homemaking and taking care of our spouses and other things that we also divert attention to, or taking care of our dog or our garden. We were talking about gardening right before we hopped onto this. So I'd love to hear, as women are coming up in the workplace and they're coming against these stereotypes, how do you recommend navigating it? How do you advocate for changing that system? What does that look like when you're working with your clients?
100%. The system is the system, right? It's not going anywhere tomorrow. I'm not delusional. Unfortunately, it has taken years and centuries, honestly, to create the system, and so we're not going to break it and just change it overnight. No, I think it takes action from both ends. In my opinion, from learning how to navigate the system, and learning how to grow within the system, but also talking about what is wrong with the system and why, and remembering it as you go through this experience, as you grow and develop and grow your career. There's another book that I'm reading right now. I was actually on a run listening to this book today. It's called Presence by Amy Cuddy. It's incredible also. But she talks about a study where people who gain power and influence in society, a lot of the times they start, at least there's a correlation, that they stop thinking about others as much, and they kind of start seeing others as stereotypes, and that's where biases starting to come into play much more, etc. And so the only way to balance that out is to remember that you want to be a good human, and to go into every action with this in mind. So basically, navigate the system, learn how to play the game, but also keep your compass, keep your moral compass in the right spot, and continue understanding what is wrong with the system in order not to get clouded by those biases, in order not to get clouded by the system and think, oh, well, I've had to go through it, so everybody has to go through it. So that's my approach from both ends. But, essentially, whenever I talk to my clients, the gist of it is, first of all, understand your landscape, right? Try to understand, try to observe who has power, right? Who what is the power dynamics in the landscape that you're in, whether it's your company or industry, etc. Whatever system that you're trying to play, understand the power dynamics, understand the key players and their interests, and then try to understand how you can build those strategic relationships with those key partners, having their interests in mind. And at the end of the day, realizing that everybody's human and nobody is holier than thou. And even the CEO has a dog that they love and want to play with, and you can bond over something like that.
Yeah. It's interesting because we've talked about the influencer list on my podcast before, which is really a list of all of the people in your organization who you believe currently or may one day have influence over your career progression, right? And that's not always people who are more senior than you. It can be somebody who's the same level as you, who has a lot of influence, who people really trust and listen to. It could be somebody more junior than you who's very outspoken in their opinions and their perspectives, and understanding, to your point, those power dynamics. And then how do you build relationships with those individuals? Because, I think people tend to get a bad perspective that they think, oh, well, it's inauthentic if I'm seeking them out just because I know that they're in a power position. It's inauthentic for me to build a relationship with them on purpose. And I talk with one of my clients about this a lot, but it's like dating, right? If you're going to go on a bunch of dates, you want to at least have some potential in some of those dates for it to go somewhere, for you to like them. And that doesn't mean that you wouldn't go on a date with somebody who doesn't immediately look great on paper, but you're being strategic in who you choose to spend time with. And the same is true in the workplace, right?
100%.
Seek those people out, find those opportunities, build those relationships, because in my experience, I'm sure as you've experienced, relationships are what help you progress your career.
100%. And, like you said, it's not being strategic about who you build relationships with is not a bad thing. It's not a manipulative thing, right?
Yeah.
It is manipulative if you pretend to be someone else in order to build that relationship. Now, that's what it's just like with dating, right? You pretend that you also love this person's favorite, I don't know, basketball team, and all of a sudden you're the biggest fan, but actually you don't know anything, and then you could be exposed. That could be manipulative. But if you are seeking them out because you think that they would be good for your career, but then you are approaching the relationship from an authentic place, that is different. Yeah. And to your point also, that person could be more junior, that person could be your peer, or that person could be in a different department, completely different department, but you get along, you work well, and later down the line, this person might be forming a team and you will be the person that they will think of straight away. And I think a lot of it comes down to personal branding. And personal branding, there's a theory that I teach my clients, which consists of the pie model. Have you heard of the pie model?
No.
So the pie model starts for performance, image, and exposure. So performance is your performance, right? How good are you at what you're doing? Image is how others are perceiving you, right? What do you come off as? And that is essentially how other people will describe you when you're not in the room. And then exposure is who are those people and what rooms are they essentially describing you in? Yeah. And this brings you opportunities, because this person who is in a parallel department could be that door opener who could describe you in the way you want to be described in the right room. That brings you opportunities, that grows your career. And that's what I think is all about. That's essentially personal branding. A lot of people think, oh, personal branding is just posting on social media. No.
Yeah, it's so much more.
It's so much more. But yeah.
And I'm going to have a t-shirt made that says this, I promise, because I think I mention it once a week on some kind of forum. And I talked about it actually with a group that I did a speaking engagement with last week. But to me, your brand enters the room before you do, and it leaves after.
Yeah.
Right? Yeah. What you do, how you talk about yourself, how you represent yourself, the work that you deliver, it builds this brand. But there are always going to be people talking about you when you're not around.
Yep.
Right? And a lot of people, they don't understand how cross calibrations work. I talk about this a lot on my page. But while cross calibrations are not a popularity contest necessarily, when you are up for promotion or a raise or a bonus, they're going to sit in a room, all of the leaders, and they're going to say, okay, who knows Masha? And literally people will raise their hands and they'll say, okay, Masha's up for a promotion. Does anybody disagree? They're going to discuss you and they're going to talk about what value you bring, what's good about your work, what you have opportunities to improve on. And so the more intentional you are with how you build your brand, how you communicate about yourself, what you communicate about yourself, the stronger that reputation and that brand becomes, and the more people talk about it, which ultimately, to your point, opens doors. It gets you opportunities, whether that's a project or a job or a title or a promotion. And without that personal brand, you're just showing up to a call. Like nobody will value you the same way.
Exactly. And I love, you know, the phrase that you say all the time, the t-shirt. I might ask you for a copy of that t-shirt, because I think that, you know, like, I think of personal brand sometimes as when you leave the room and you have a very nice scent, like nice perfume, it stays, it lingers in the room, and people can still perceive it. And that's my visualization of that concept.
Yeah. And I always think about it, like, I feel like we've all worked with somebody that we thought really highly of. And when you heard they were on a project, it's like a sigh of relief. You're like, oh, good. They'll get done what they're supposed to do. They'll deliver stuff on time. They'll be a good team member. And like, that's the vibe you want to be spreading about yourself, right?
Exactly.
You don't want them to say, well, Kendall's on a project, and everybody goes, oh, God, again, I have to work with her again, right? Like, you want that strong brand, because even when you're not around, people are thinking it.
Exactly. And that's why Pi starts with performance, because ultimately, without good performance, right, if you just build an image that is empty, that doesn't back itself up, eventually people are going to know that, and they're going to not want to work with you. So that is why performance is essentially the foundation of your personal brand, but it will not speak for itself unless you speak for itself. You need to advocate for it with those key stakeholders. You need to really communicate your value to them, because without that, they're not going to know about it, because they have their own lives, right? They have their own priorities. They have their own to-dos. They have their own families. And we're just, at the end of the day, we're human, right? And no matter how objectively great you are at what you do, sometimes somebody else is, there's the recency bias. We were talking to, the person was talking to your colleague more recently and remembers their work, and therefore that person gets the promotion, not you. Yeah. Because there's a recency bias, and that's it. You know,
I love calling attention to the recency bias, because I think that is a big thing. I talk with managers and leaders a lot about, like, we all have short-term memory, like everybody. And once again, we're going to equate this to dating. That's just my theme for the day. Not that I've dated in like 15 years, but if I had dated, it would be like this. No. But when you're dating somebody or you're married and you have a fight, in that moment, you're like, why was I ever interested in you? We have nothing in common. Like, it doesn't matter if you've been together 20 years. All of a sudden, in the middle of an argument, like, your entire history could not exist, and it is only the argument that you're in. And it's the same as true with work. And it's something that I, as a manager, have to pace myself with. Like, if my team does something to upset me, I have to take a step back and go, they've done a ton of great work. One mistake does not define their performance. I need to take a breath, write it down, think about what's happening. Is it a pattern? Is it a one-off? And then deliver feedback. And I think that's why a lot of managers get a bad rep, because something happens and they just jump on it. They're like, oh, you shouldn't have done that. That's bad. Instead of like taking a moment to see, like, is this a pattern or is it a one-off?
Yep.
But secondarily, it is so true in progressing your career. Because if I did a great project in 2022 and I delivered and everybody was super impressed, and then in 2023 I do nothing, but somebody else does something great, for the 2023 round of promotions, I am not in that bucket. And it doesn't matter that I did great work last year and that I didn't get promoted for it, or that it was better than what was done this year. It just means that, like, I can't get the promotion. I have that recency. So yeah, so I think it's interesting that when you are up for promotion, progression, any type of conversation like that, if you haven't done something recently, if they don't know inherently the value that you're bringing in a short time span, ultimately the effect of that really dwindles, unfortunately.
100%. And I want to take it a step further with recency biases, with the recency bias and our own perception of ourselves, because we also have that
Mm.
um, with ourselves, and that can really affect our self-esteem. And that
Yeah.
goes back to the confidence. Oh my God, we're closing the loop here.
Look at that full circle we made.
Look at that. But basically, uh, a lot of the times, no matter how great we were before and all the different achievements, we have a recency bias when it comes to our own performance. Let's say, you failed at a project, at the most recent project, you didn't deliver the right numbers, and all of a sudden, all you can think of, oh my God, I'm a failure. And
Yeah.
that reflects in all of your work, in the way you present yourself, in the way you carry yourself at work, even your body language. It all reflects in that you think
Yes.
I'm a failure, despite the fact that you've had a whole career of these amazing achievements and you've been building up on it and building and building and building. So I think it's very important um, to create a system where you don't where you can see what happened before, prior to
Love that.
this most recent failure, right? Or if you had an achievement, still see your history of achievements, because that will help you build that confidence and that belief in yourself and understanding the value that you're bringing to the table. I think it's incredibly important to understand that value, because unless you understand it, you're not able to communicate it.
Yes.
Unless you understand it, you're not going to be able to advocate for yourself. And so, one of the exercises that I have created and I share in my course, the Professional Recognition Lab, and that is a free exercise that anybody can download if they go on my social links and Instagram and TikTok, is a daily progress tracker. So essentially, it's a Google Doc and you can copy it. It's a template where you can track your daily progress. What have you achieved? What have you moved the needle on? Why is it important? Who does it benefit? So that you start recognizing it over and over and over again. And then as part of the exercise, then you do a summary at the end of the quota or at the end of the month or whatever cadence that works for you. But essentially that allows you to recognize your own value and build the confidence from the inside, as opposed to waiting for that recognition that will come from your manager that might not be able to see your work because they're just too busy with their own stuff.
Yeah. Yeah, no,
So,
I love that. And there's two things I want to touch on that. The first is when I'm working with clients, I talk a lot about identifying your strengths, and the
mhm,
best way to do that is through pattern analysis.
mm,
If you track what you do every day and the projects you do well on and the projects you don't, that's how you identify your strengths, is in the patterns. If you do
mhm,
really well on chaos projects but you don't do well on highly organized ones, organization's probably a skill of yours and you're bringing that to the chaos projects, which is why you do well there. And so it's so interesting. Like, I also advocate for tracking everything you do. I think it's so important because you're right. Like, hearing you say that we have recency bias, I'm like, I have so done that, where I have looked at myself and been like, I can't believe I failed that project. I should have done better. I'm better than this. And then you're hard on yourself. And then I'm like, I'm going to get fired. Like, you just take it to this nth degree when the reality is it's not representative of the whole and of everything that you bring.
mhm,
And the second thing I wanted to touch on is I've been working on redefining imposter syndrome, just,
mm,
for Webster. And what I think is so interesting about imposter syndrome is, to me, it's not about a lack of confidence. It's about a lack of trust in yourself to learn what needs to be learned.
mhm,
And when you look back on your career and you take a moment and say, what are all the things I've done? I was not capable of being a director when I was 21 and fresh out of college. I didn't have the skills yet. I've learned that over decades of work and been able to apply it to get to the title that I'm at. And the same is true if you find yourself in a CEO role. If you don't know how to do that job, odds are, just like you learned to be a director and a VP, you can learn those skills and apply them. And so when imposter syndrome starts to sneak in, it's important to look back and say, what are all the things I've already learned and
mhm,
already becoming confident in? And can I use that to motivate myself to do well in this new job? And so I love kind of the parallels in that personal development as well.
100%. And I think that's so incredibly beautiful, just seeing those moments of strength, right? And applying them and being like, you know what? It's a new unknown, because every situation is unknown. We don't know what we're doing. Let's just be honest. We are figuring it out as we go along, right? We are, and some of us have done it before, so we can refer back to that previous knowledge. But some of us are just using our learning skills, like you said. We've done it before. We've been in an unknown situation before. Now, how do we deal with an unknown situation? And the more comfortable you are with those unknown situations, the more comfortable you will be with them in the future, right?
Exactly.
And I feel like that is ultimately confidence, right?
Yep.
Exposing yourself to unknown situations and knowing that you will be able to figure it out.
Yeah.
Like, a lot of my clients, they have issues with confidence when responding to questions in presentations. And one of the biggest things that I tell them is create potential responses for the hardest questions. Think through the questions that can come up and practice them beforehand. Because when you are presented with that situation, you don't have to scramble, your brain doesn't spiral down, but you have a response. And you feel much more confident presenting just knowing that you have responses for those questions. And so it's just like knowing that you will be okay in a situation where you don't know what to do. That's huge. It's part of it.
No, and I love it. And I think that this is such a great place for us to end our podcast today, because we've been able to, one, really go full circle with all of these topics, but also address what I think is top of mind for most people as they progress into senior roles, which is that insecurity, that lack of confidence, that willingness to show up and figure it out anyways, and also that recency bias that makes us so hard on ourselves. And so this has been an amazing chat. Masha, thank you so much for coming on the podcast and sharing all of your words of wisdom. Again, for anybody listening, if you want to check her out, Stereotype Breakers. She's got a blog. She's on TikTok. She's on Instagram. She is a wealth of knowledge, so highly recommend that you check her out. And we will have to have you back again for sure.
Thank you so much for having me, Kendall. This was awesome, and I can't wait for more conversations online and offline with you, because they're always great.
Yeah, no, I appreciate it, Masha. Thanks so much.